Welcome everyone to this important event on the sidelines of the United Nations ECOSOC Youth Forum. I want to give a special thank you to the survivors and the activists of Nordic Model Now for co-sponsoring this event, especially to Anna Fisher, who is the co-founder of Nordic Model Now. My name is Monique Beadle. I'm the Director of U.S. Policy for the Jerusalem Institute of Justice. For over 15 years, the Jerusalem Institute of Justice has pushed for the abolition of the prostitution industry in Israel. And together with a network of 22 other Israeli organizations who are dedicated to this issue, in 2018, we succeeded in persuading the Knesset to adopt an innovative legal model that was pioneered actually in Sweden. Now, this model has many names. Some call it the Nordic model, the abolitionist model, the partial decriminalization model, or the equality model. It is the only approach to addressing the abuse of women and girls in the sex industry that places the enforcement burdens on the buyers and places the rehabilitation emphasis on the survivors. So this legal approach has also been adopted by Norway, Iceland, Canada, Ireland, France, Israel, of course, and in other jurisdictions like Northern Ireland and the state of Maine in the United States. There's also a version of this model that has been adopted in South Korea. A few vital statistics to guide our discussion. These are all from the Israeli perspective. In Israel, an estimated 14,000 people are prostituted every day. 76% of prostituted women in Israel, when surveyed, said that they would leave prostitution if they had the ability to do so. 62% of women in prostitution are mothers, and 81% of the mothers have children under the age of 18. In the last 15 years, over 110 people who have been prostituted have also been murdered or died in Israel as a result of abuse or STDs, and the average age of death is 40. Most women in prostitution in Israel experienced sexual abuse in childhood, and the average age for entrance into the industry is 13 or 14 years old. So this is such a relevant topic for the Youth Forum. Meanwhile, nearly all of the sex buyers in Israel are men, and this is true in every country around the world. The buyers are ordinary men, married men, fathers, businessmen, politicians. They pay money to pimps to buy themselves the illusion of consent. And until recently, they did this with complete impunity. But we'll discuss today this new legal model, which we are pushing, which can end the cycle of impunity and violence. Now, it's an honor today to have several speakers who have stood at the forefront of this struggle. We're going to begin with remarks from Shuli Moalem. She is a former member of the Israeli Knesset, and she's really served as a champion of the equality model, and she fought for its adoption into Israeli law. So now it's my honor to give the floor to Shuli Moalem.
Good evening from Israel. There is something important I want you understand. After leaving prostitution, it's not over. It's actually just beginning, because the drugs that used to numb the smell, the horrors, the fear, they are no longer there. Everything comes back. I wake up every day hoping that it will stop, even for 4 hours, maybe 2. Sometimes I remember things that happened to me, and I start crying, feeling like death is the only way out. I'm not afraid to die, because I'm only dead. I'm already dead. These painful, heartbreaking words came from a woman who managed to exist the cycle of prostitution. The pain and struggle she describes reflect the reality of around 14,000 women, men, and teenagers in Israel who face exploitation in the cruel system of prostitution. On December 31, 2018, a historic step toward justice was taken in Israel. The prohibition of prostitution consumption law, including the government program for the rehabilitation of prostitution survivors, passed in the Knesset unanimously. This was one of the most meaningful laws in the state of Israel, which made buying another human's body a criminal offense. 15 years after the beginning of the struggle, the Israeli public spoke out clearly and loudly. Prostitution stands in stark contradiction to every value we hold: cultural, moral, human, and social. The Jewish principle that beloved is the human being created in the image of God demands a firm rejection of prostitution and active efforts to reduce and eliminate it. In January 2013, I was sworn into the 19th Knesset. I chose to focus on several key issues, including women's rights, the advancement of women, and family values. To advocate for women, I asked to join the Committee for the Advancement of the Status of Women. Shortly after joining, I was invited to take part in the subcommittee on trafficking and prostitution. One day, along with MK Zehava Galon and MK David Sur, I joined an on-site visit to prostitution hotspots, streets, and so-called discreet apartments. On the same day, we also visited the special exit and support services for survivors of prostitution. Until then, I thought I was familiar with all the country's dark corners, but that day hit me like a punch to the gut. I realized there was an entire world of endless human tragedy, exploitation, and power, profound injustice I was unaware of. After that tour, I couldn't turn back. I decided to commit to the struggle fully. I joined MK Zehava Galon, then chair of Meretz Party, in advancing legislation to hold sex buyers accountable and to support the rehabilitation of women exiting prostitution. What happened in Israel during the fight against prostitution became a model of female leadership. It was a kind of leadership that says, we may differ on many issues and pursue separate paths or arenas, but when it comes to the values we share, we stand united with full force and unwavering commitment. Zehava Galon and I, women from opposite ends of the political spectrum, worked together and succeeded in passing the law. 74 members of the Knesset voted in favor of it. We brought together members of the Knesset from all political parties and officials from key government ministers, including justice, public security and the police, finance, health, and education. We worked with civil society organizations, local authorities, and the media. As time went on, the struggle against prostitution became a central part of my agenda, not only as a member of Knesset, but as a woman in Israel. I founded the Coalition of Religious Organizations Against Prostitution and worked to bring new voices into the fight, including groups that had not previously been involved. We all aspired to build a model society grounded in mutual responsibility, social justice, and tikkun olam, a vision rooted in Judaism that calls for repairing the world through ethical action and care for others. Implementing the law required the active involvement of all government ministers. The Ministry of Education played a key role in driving the cultural changes we hoped to see, so that women in prostitution would no longer appear at high school graduation parties or bachelor parties, and above all, so that we would understand that women, men, and youth in prostitution were not others. They were part of us, part of our society. The Ministry of Welfare, which leads the National Rehabilitation Program for survivors of prostitution, has made real progress in expanding valuable services and developing new ones. At the beginning of the process, we believed the right legislative approach was to criminalize sex buyers and support the rehabilitation of women in prostitution. The law that ultimately passed prohibits paying for prostitution, yet enforces this through administrative penalties and monetary fines. This legal step has already had deterrent effect, with a marked decline in demand. The Justice Minister's decision to make the law permanent, along with the launch of a nationwide public awareness campaign, sends a clear message. We are confronting the dark reality of prostitution head on. The prostitution system is real. It kills women and girls. It traps the most vulnerable, and it makes it nearly impossible for them to break free. Our goal was to shift the responsibility to the sex buyers, to fight the demand itself. In recent years, prostitution has moved deeper into the shadows of the internet, and it has become increasingly challenging to reach for the forces behind it, the pimps and criminal networks. But we are also seeing growing public support for the law and the broader struggle, with more organization involved, more brothels shut down, action taken against strip clubs, brothels in disguise, and more significant efforts to remove barriers to exiting the sex trade, including expunging criminal records and helping with debt relief. The goal to reach every victim. We cannot afford to rest. We owe every woman, man, and teenager in prostitution an individualized path forward with long-term support. Entry into prostitution may happen quickly, but the way out takes years. It requires vocational training, housing, and intense psychological treatment to process the horrors they have endured. It also demands access to legal aid, trauma-focused medical care, financial counseling, debt relief, and safe, supportive community networks. Survivors need real opportunities to rebuild their lives with dignity through education, employment opportunities, and the sense of belonging that replaces the isolation and trauma they have known for far too long. And a final word to those in position of power who still view prostitution as a legitimate choice or just another form of work. We must stop pretending that prostitution is a neutral transaction. It is a system built on inequality, trauma, and the exploitation of the most vulnerable. Women, men, and teenagers deserve exactly what we would demand for anyone we care about: safety, dignity, opportunity, and real chance at healing. They do not deserve less because they were pushed to the margins. They are not invisible, and their pain is not inevitable. Our responsibility is not to justify the system that failed them, but to dismantle it and to build in its place a framework of protection, support, and justice. That is how we break the cycle. That is how we honor their humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shuli, for your very effective and passionate presentation and for serving as such an dedicated advocate for the rights of women and girls who are subjected to abuse in the sex industry. Your leadership has been so vital to the effort to have a completely unanimous support in the Israeli Knesset for these important ideas. So we thank you for working with your colleagues on the left and those who are secular. Even though you are on the right and from a religious community, we appreciate how you have reached out across the divides and brought hope in Israeli society. Our next speaker is Luba Fine, the co-founder of Voices of Israeli Sex Trade Survivors. Luba, the floor is yours.
I want to thank the event organizers for creating space to address one of the most urgent human rights issues of our time: the right of the most vulnerable members of our society not to be abused in prostitution systems. Most victims of prostitution are women and girls, especially ones those minority and marginalized backgrounds. International legal instruments have acknowledged that prostitution is fundamentally at odds with human dignity and value. CEDAW's Article 6 obliges states to take all appropriate measures, including legislation, to suppress all forms of trafficking in women and exploitation of prostitution of women. General Recommendations number 38 claims that trafficking and exploitation of prostitution of women and girls is unequivocally a phenomenon rooted in structural sex-based discrimination constituting gender-based violence. Article 1 of the 1949 Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Persons and of the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others requires states to punish anyone who procures, entices, or leads away for purposes of prostitution another person, or who exploits the prostitution of another person, even with the consent of that person. Article 2 calls to take action against pimps. The Palermo Protocol likewise states that the consent of a trafficked person is irrelevant in cases of exploitation and calls on states parties to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation of persons, especially women and children, that leads to trafficking. However, the right of women and girls not to be bought and sold has been increasingly contested in recent years, even within institutions and frameworks that were originally created to protect us, such as UN-related bodies and procedures. A striking example can be found in 2021 UNAIDS fact sheet on HIV, which refers to sex buyers as clients and claims that holding them accountable through criminal law somehow infringes on the rights of those in prostitution. Such framing not only legitimizes the commodification of human beings, but also shifts the focus away from the systems of violence and inequality that drive sexual exploitation. It is not the persecution of exploiters that harms the exploited. It is the exploitation itself. Believe us. Following this logic, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls published another document in 2023, document titled Eliminating Discrimination Against Sex Workers and Securing Their Human Rights. And that document claimed that sex work is cited a term preferred by persons who sell sexual services. Consistent with this approach, the document refers to pimps, some of the most violent and exploitative actors in this system, as managers, organizers, and facilitators, and goes so far as to call for their decriminalization, allegedly for the benefit of the victims. This trend culminated in the March 2024 publication of a guide on the human rights of sex workers. This is the guide issued by UN mandate holders, including the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health and the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, above mentioned. Rather than addressing the structural conditions that trap women and girls in prostitution, the guide reframed the prostitution system as ordinary labor. It denounced efforts to criminalize sex buyers, referring to such policies as human rights violations, criminalizing sex buyers, human rights violation, and it described pimps as facilitators and organizers, obscuring the violence and exploitation at the heart of their role. By elevating the language of bodily autonomy while erasing the multidimensional coercion and systemic inequality behind prostitution, this document promotes a narrative of consent when there is no real choice. However, in June 2024, a powerful shift in tone came with the publication of the report Prostitution and Violence Against Women and Girls by Rimal Salem, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls. This report was grounded in consultations with sex trade survivor-led organizations from all across the globe and drew upon nearly 300 submissions from experts and frontline advocates. Al-Salem rejected the sanitized language of sex work, choosing instead to name prostitution as a system of violence rooted in patriarchal power, inequality, and coercion. She framed prostitution not just as a form of violence, but also as its cause and consequence. The report called for the adoption of the abolitionist model, full decriminalization of prostituted persons, criminalization of pimps and sex buyers, investment in exit programs, and public campaigns to end demand. Most importantly, it recentered human rights on the side of the exploited, not the exploiters. When this report was presented in the Human Rights Council, survivor-led organizations across the globe, we watched it and we felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that their voices had truly been heard. It marked a moment of recognition, a clear break from the policies that have long ignored or erased our lived realities. For many, it was more than just a report. It was a sign of hope that the UN might finally reorient its approach, placing the rights and safety of the exploited above the interest of those who benefit from exploitation. And we expected this report to begin a new chapter rooted in truth, accountability, and justice. It has been almost a year, and we are still waiting for that report to be implemented. Yet already, we hear voices dismissing its findings, claiming that its perspective does not represent a vague and undefined entity called the sex workers. An average person would assume that this term, sex workers, refer to those coaching systems of prostitution, right? However, we never agreed to this rhetoric. Survivors of the sex trade do not need euphemisms. Independently of its legal and social framing, prostitution can never ever be decent work. No work is performed by a customer inside an employee's body. In no field of employment is exposure to male violence is so extremely intensive but also unavoidable. There is no work where being a minor, inexperienced, and naive is rewarded. There is no work that employees can do while being tired, drugged, or too cognitively disabled to understand what is happening to them. A situation not uncommon in prostitution. Additionally, in prostitution, the preconditions for non-coerced consent to sex do not exist. Consent relies on four preconditions: the freedom to choose a sexual partner, the freedom to select the nature of the sexual activity, the freedom to choose the timing of sexual activity, and the freedom to withdraw the consent at any moment, right? None of this exists in prostitution, which makes it the entire practice an act of abuse, definitely not a job. For the above-mentioned reasons, we refuse being rebranded as sex workers. This term fails to take into account the grave human rights violations that characterize the prostitution systems. This term gaslights victims. A rich and constantly evolving body of knowledge shows that framing prostitution as work makes it offensive and very difficult to treat. In Germany, a large proportion of women are in prostitution against their will. In the Northern Territories in Australia, sex buyers are allowed by law to sue those involved in prostitution if they are not satisfied with the service. In Belgium, if a prostitute refuses a sex buyer more than 10 times over 6 months, a pimp can trigger an intervention by a government mediator. Great, right? In New Zealand, 85% of all prostitutes are willing to exit, but there is no funding to support their exiting. Globally, legalized or decriminalized prostitution is associated with high rates of sex trafficking. Prostitution is destructive and harmful. It can involve non-state torture and leaves its victims in a worse situation in every respect: physically, financially, mentally, and socially. Many survivors go through such severe trauma that they never recover from it entirely. Since the system of prostitution is driven by demand, there is no more beneficial strategy for current victims, potential victims, and society as a whole than focusing efforts on eradicating pimps and sex buyers. No woman, man, or child, no matter how vulnerable, will be exploited in the sex industry if there are no pimps and no sex buyers. No policymakers, public opinion leaders, lawmakers, or self-proclaimed sex work activists have the mandate to promote our exploiters and abusers, not in our name. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luba, for bringing a persuasive overview of the rhetoric that surrounds this issue and for very directly challenging the sophisticated agenda of the pimp lobby. You have a really candid voice and it cuts through the noise and it really highlights the brutal realities at play here, and I appreciate it. We're now going to address the youth component of this topic with our next speaker. Ellie Arrow is a Germany-based activist against commercial sexual exploitation. Her focus is on prostitution history, impact, and policy, and she communicates about this through social media. She has a podcast called Red Light Expose, and she also writes and researches for news outlets and anti-trafficking organizations. Ellie, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to spend my 10 minutes on the subject of sexual exploitation in youth. I come from Germany, a country where famously or infamously prostitution is legal. This is an issue I've been looking into since I was 16, and then I became an activist at 19. Sometimes people are surprised. Why would somebody that young look into something that dark, right? And I've since connected with women around the world who started getting into this topic as teenagers or in our early 20s. Because we often call stripping, porn, and prostitution the adult business. It's some adults, consenting adults over there. It's nothing to do with teenagers, right? We're all against child trafficking. We always hear this rhetoric. But the reason that activists like myself are so passionate about this, one core reason is once you start investigating this industry and who's actually in it and being exploited and harmed, well, young people are the product. So you can look at studies from many, many different countries. The mostly men who use this industry prefer someone who is still malleable, impressionable, and not financially solid. That is the easiest group of people to recruit and then to abuse with limited consequence. And so the biggest population in the industry is young women in their 20s up to the mid 30s. And it's not that unusual that there are, both in porn and prostitution, quite disturbing requests around pedophilic scenarios, incest scenarios, teacher-student scenarios. Teen is a very popular porn genre, as we all know. In Germany, we have brothels that are called teeny brothels, specifically specializing in barely adults. But once you dive deeper, you see that adult sexual exploitation and underage sexual exploitation is deeply tied, because if you ask adults in the industry at what age they entered, a significant number will tell you they were under 18 at the time. Even more concerning, and again connected what Luba started with, the rhetoric of sex work and everything associated with it, like harm denialism and empowerment narrative, is actually trickling down to underage people. I've read extensively academic literature, policy papers, NGO statements that use the term child sex worker, underage sex worker, and start talking about agency and harm reduction rather than saying someone under 18, we need to get them out of the system as fast as possible. And even someone over 18, barely adult, still trying to find their footing in the world, maybe this isn't a great option for them and maybe they deserve services as well. And I'll say it again, I think this industry, I care about this so much because I realized us young people, we are the target, especially young women. And this industry has quite an impressive and concerning hold on media. We all know sex sells. So this simple narrative of the girl boss sex worker who is self-employed and she makes lots of money and she can retire early, that sells so well. We've seen so many news stories, YouTube videos, TikToks selling that. That is going straight into the minds of young people consuming social media. I remember, like, before I was able to access critical content, I believed it. I believed some women are just born, and I guess it starts expressing in puberty, and they are naturally submissive, and this is a great job for them, and it sets them up for a future, especially in this world where many young people feel that life is precarious. This can be as overt as an actual ad. You can see here an example from Twitter that I got just last year saying, click here, become a cam girl, right? And the visuals are all glamorous. And you usually don't see the middle-aged men that you will have to be engaging with, or, you know, the details of what they will want from you. So that's kind of this internet culture that young people are marinating in. So it's really ubiquitous. You don't even have to go on a porn site to see this kind of content. And then if you live in a country like mine, Germany, where brothels are legal, on top of the internet content, if you are in a big city, like around the train stations or in certain parts of town, you will have brothels like the one you see here. This is the very brothel that I would pass every day on my way to university, getting a degree. Every single day I'd go past it. This is a mega brothel with dozens and dozens of women in it. I could actually see what I would assume are dubious men driving the women in their big cars, bringing it to the place and then picking them up. These are legal brothels, but trafficking actually happens. But you don't know that. I would see children, families passing by like it was normal. And only when you do the research do you realize what happens behind that facade. And really, like, what does it do to a young girl growing up to see this normalized? Sometimes you'd see the women in lingerie because you can see through the door, through the glass door, standing there. What does it say about womanhood and sex when someone's just starting puberty, just starting to process their role in the world? It's not safe and it's not healthy. And I can really empathize with young people who fall for the sex work story. I get it. Again, it's ubiquitous. We're still discovering ourselves. This is quite a convincing narrative. And I mean, we're living in a time of increased financial precarity for many people, but especially young people. So even in developed countries, my generation is predicted to be financially poorer than our parents. And this idea of easy money, all you have to do is sex. That sounds inconsequential at first sight. It's really, unfortunately, hitting home. It looks appealing. I would hear it at university, a young woman worrying about money, worrying about rent, and talking to each other about whether OnlyFans or escorting might be a solution. We've made a lot of progress in the world as well, but familial abuse, relationship abuse is still a big issue, and this often ties into it. So if the culture tells you commodifying your body, that can be a winning strategy. And you've learned men touch my body against my will anyway. Why not commercialize it? That is one of the standard ways that young women, barely adult women, get into the industry. And just to really drive home the point, I have a quote from Sandra Norak, who's a prostitution survivor and legal scholar in Germany, and she described the tactic that her trafficker used to convince her. So he said to her, "This is all completely normal and a job like any other. Back then, had society told me," she says, "prostitution is dangerous, violent, and an affront to human dignity, these traffickers would have had it much harder to entice me to enter prostitution. I would have been warned." So it really matters what the media says, social media says, governments say. This has a direct impact. And just for context, Sandra was groomed as a depressed teenager online when her ordeal started. It goes even further. I am not just speculating, right? This is not just an opinion. We have lots of research coming in on the sex lives of young people. So rather than exploring at your own pace with someone your own age, it is so clear that porn is shaping the sexuality that young people are having. Not only are we having less sex, when it's happening, it is more brutal on average, more performative, and actually less satisfying even to a lot of the boys and men. There's the normalization of eroticized strangulation, unsafe anal sex, revenge porn, not enough awareness still around condom use and STIs. That sexual culture, again, is another factor that can set one up for entry into the industry. On screen, you can see Lily Phillips, who is currently a porn performer who went viral on the internet, again on TikTok, a place that a lot of young people use as well, talking about how she first encountered porn when she was 11, and she thought it was very normal, right? She didn't have critical content, critical voices around her. It seemed like this is just how you have sex, so why not put money on it? And the realization of how dangerous and criminal and harmful that industry is for many, many women comes much, much later. And I do also think this is a harmful system for men and boys. So they might feel like they're winning because it's, sex at the push of a button to go to the brothel. But there's a lot of concerning information that you learn once you look at how men start using, especially the prostitution industry, because quite a number of them start very young, including as minors. In countries like Switzerland, you can legally start going to the brothel at 16, which is, in my opinion, like a completely unacknowledged crime against boys that we're not discussing, really. And there's quite a lot of cultures where entry into manhood starts with your first sexual experience, and one way to have that quickly is groups of men get together and they take a teenage boy or barely adult man to the brothel, right? Through the brothel into manhood. And this is, again, something I'm very concerned about. The small piece of hope here is that statistics show us most men start buying access to women in prostitution in their 20s. And if you can intervene before that or during that age, and they do not make it a habit, it does not become their sexual template, you can decrease rates. They're not as likely to start at an older age. So it really matters what messages we send to boys. What is a real man? Again, this is a real example of an ad. This was a brothel in Austria looking for men who would be paid for testing brothels and then writing reviews about women's bodies and their sexual behavior. And I thought it was quite a potent illustration with the Superman image here. Like, the industry has a vision of who boys and men are, which is sort of, slave to their libido. They are not complex human beings with capacity for communication, complex emotions. They are kind of born to use and to dominate, and this is what they should strive for. And this is, again, of course, exemplified in the now globally infamous misogynistic influencer Andrew Tate, who sells this rhetoric, who actually sells courses on how to, what many would say now, sex traffic women, and he's now accused in 3 different countries, stands legally accused of rape and human trafficking. And unfortunately, this is one of several such figures that's in the ears of boys and trying to drive them towards that vision of manhood. But I do think, and I do hear from my peers, that there's many who do not like this vision for men. They don't think this is a happy winning strategy for some kind of brilliant future. And really, I think any issue that political young people are involved with can connect to this, whether they're interested in women's rights, gay rights, again, even like men's mental health, men's well-being, anti-racism, wealth inequality, disability rights. All of these issues really come together and all these different forms of abuse and oppression are extreme in the industry. And that's what I found. I was interested in women's rights. Then I started analyzing prostitution through that lens. And I think there's real potential here to galvanize interests around these issues and realize prostitution should be on top of the agenda for all these different movements. And increasingly, thankfully, it is. And I think there's much that can be done. I think for many of us, certainly for me, it started by talking to friends and peers, making sure that others who have doubts about prostitution or porn don't feel crazy, don't feel alone. It started with talking to our teachers or our professors and demanding that we actually learn. There's so many different fields, political science, social work, medicine, psychology, where it should be standard training to learn about this issue because it's not a tiny industry. We know the numbers are big. And then finally, there's the option to form organizations or join existing ones where youth can discuss, organize, volunteer. And that's certainly, that movement is growing here in Germany, thankfully, despite our strong prostitution culture. And I'll just finish on my last point here with just some examples of different projects and ideas of how to approach it. For people interested in the US, there is, for example, the World Without Exploitation, who is an anti-trafficking and anti-prostitution organization fighting for the equality model, who have an extra youth coalition. So that's when older teens, young adults get together to discuss this and organize around it. Another idea from Germany is, which means I Am Not a Sex Buyer, a project where men, including a lot of young men, stand up and say, this is why I reject prostitution culture. This is why I do not want to participate. I have a different vision for how men and women can relate to each other. And finally, an example on the issue of porn, Fight the New Drug is an organization that's non-legislative. It's just saying, let's start having the conversation. How do we want to live together? What kind of sexual culture do we want? Do we like what the pornographers say about women and about men? And many young people would say no to this. We just need to know we're not alone. We're not crazy. And it's a shame that we have to, but we are working on getting that target off our backs.
Thank you so much, Ellie, for addressing the abuses of this industry from the perspective of a country where it is fully legalized in Germany. You gave such a cogent presentation on the grooming messages that are specifically directed at young people and provided some really important ideas for how to build a healthier youth culture. We have a few minutes remaining now that we've heard our initial remarks from our main speakers. I want to encourage everyone in the chat or the Q&A to make use of it. I'll try to consolidate some of the questions. The first follow-up question goes to Ellie, and it's a follow-up to the slide you shared with the advertisement for girl testers. The question is, how young are those people who are being sought to work as girl testers? Is it possible that they are minors?
So that's Austria. So I said in Switzerland, you can start at the brothel as a buyer at 16. I believe in Austria, it's 18. So we would be talking 18 and up. That doesn't mean that there aren't cases where sometimes underage boys do try to sneak into brothels or give fake ID, their brother's IDs. There are cases like that. I would assume in this case they would have hired an adult man, but that doesn't make it any less concerning. And again, like all the language around this, like testing girls, that is really ugly language. And there was pushback to that particular poster. They had to take it down. They then replaced it. And they said, we are looking for lady testers. And then they said, man, woman, non-binary can apply. So they were making fun of, gender equality by that remix to the poster. That's what happened. And I'm happy to provide a source on that particular event or social or media gag that they were going for.
Thank you, Ellie. The next question is for Luba. Luba, we have Mike in the comments asking whether sex tourism is a significant problem in Israel or in neighboring countries, and a related question from Dan, whether you differentiate between women using it for, quote, quick money versus women forced into prostitution. What are your thoughts on those questions, Luba?
I will answer quickly, and I think maybe we can add something. About sex tourism in Israel, tourists paying for prostitution, they exist everywhere. obviously in Israel, but Israel is not an attractive destination for sex tourists because we don't have like 4-6 floors brothels like in Germany. Advertisement is illegal. Everything is illegal. You can be arrested. We don't have huge facilities for prostitution. So prostitution here is not entertaining enough for someone to come specifically to consume prostitution. But obviously it happens like everything happens. But this is not a popular sex tourist destination. However, Israeli men, I can see it in social media and everywhere, Israeli men do go abroad to Germany, to Dubai, to Thailand, to Romania, to many countries. They go to pay for prostitution. I'm ashamed of them. And I hope that after many years of the Nordic model of education and campaigning, men will be more and more ashamed to do it even abroad. Also, I hope that someday we will adopt a Norwegian law that criminalizes paying for sex of the citizens also abroad. And about differentiation do you differentiate between a woman using prostitution for quick money versus a woman forced into prostitution? The difference is like a woman who was forcibly married to a violent husband and a woman who married a violent husband out of love because she believed that he is good, but he still murdered her. This is the difference, because you can enter prostitution because you were lied about its nature. And very often women enter prostitution without understanding what it is and they find it out too late. But prostitution is traumatizing anyway. And yes, sometimes women are groomed, manipulated, lied to, promised the luxury, charming men, and they will be able to choose any man they want. Yes, many women are groomed by lies, which is a very interesting fact about quick money. I interviewed thousands of women in prostitution during my long life in abolitionist activity. I'm 53 and I'm an abolitionist for 30 years. I haven't met a single woman who gained significant capital. Best case scenario, the women gave the money away to exploitative families. Worst case scenario, the money just gone to pimps, to drug dealers, like anyone. So this is the difference.
Shuli, you played a critical role in passing the Nordic model in Israel, which addresses strip clubs and brothels and other places where women are abused in the prostitution industry. But we're struggling still with the internet prostitution and with pornography. Are there any good solutions here?
אני חושבת שהדרך העיקרית היא חינוך. היכולת להשתלט על זנות דיגיטלית ועל קביעת מפגשי זנות דרך האינטרנט היא כמעט בלתי אפשרית. על כל פעם שסוגרים אתר פורנוגרפי אחד שממילא נמצא מעבר לים, אז פותחים במקביל 5 אתרים אחרים. אני חושבת שהדרך העיקרית היא חינוך, וליצור מצב של יותר ויותר גברים בגיל ההתבגרות, שעוברים את הסדנה של הג'ון סקול, של להבין מה עושה זנות, מי זאת האישה בזנות, ומה המשמעות של החיים שלה.
Which Shuli's answer, she believes that enforcing anti-prostitution laws in the internet is extremely difficult, and here we should educate young men, because blocking any website the contact in the purpose of prostitution is very hard. So we should go to use education, use campaigning. Actually, if I can say that I partially agree with you, but not fully agree. I think that we do have ways to stop online prostitution. First, Israel has a very good act, which is the Web Blocking Act. We can immediately block any website which promotes illegal activity. And in Israel, indeed, every year, police blocks several hundreds of prostitution websites. And once the site was framed as illegal site, it will be blocked and they've changed address. This is a great law, not implemented enough. It should be implemented better. And about prostitution transactions and the contacts online, most of prostitution is organized. There is no a huge amount of individual women in prostitution. most prostitution is criminal organizations, and they should be targeted, and digitally they can be identified. This is what I think, and I agree with surely that education is necessary, and from the current Nordic model we can start education for the younger generation, so it will be more education, less enforcement. So this is my opinion.
Thank you, Luba. And Julie, I'm glad we have you back. My final question is for Ellie. We have seen in Israel that the adoption of the Nordic equality abolitionist model has succeeded in changing attitudes in the Israeli public. There was a recent survey that showed that about 73% of Israelis surveyed said that they see prostitution as a form of violence. Can you talk to us about what public attitudes are like in a country where prostitution is fully legalized? Show us the other side of the coin.
Well, it's not as straightforward. And I should say there's been a lot of change the last decade. So if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, well, I have a minority opinion. Now I know with current polling on what people think of the prostitution system, people are far more educated on trafficking. More people have heard the slogan like Germany as the brothel of Europe. There's much more concern in the population. I'd say we had seen a shift due to really hard work, especially by survivors and survivor organizations, to get more awareness. And the current attitude is, well, 10 years ago, it might have been, this is a job or not my business. Now it's, oh, I think we have problems, but people are unsure how to fix them. So they are open to something needs to change, different laws, different funding to go somewhere else, but they're still skeptical of the equality model. There's been a lot of push to discredit it through all the common myths that we hear at it, and that has stuck to some extent. Even just now, we had the current government in the coalition agreement say that they acknowledged we are a major hub for trafficking, but they want to wait until we have more evaluations before they will actually do anything. And they have not, even though the biggest political party originally promised to actually pass an equality model, they have sacrificed that in their coalition talks, unfortunately. So it might well be another decade before we see real change. Right now, we're in like a weird in-between situation. People see there's an issue, but they feel like, oh, equality model is too radical. Can't we do more bureaucracy and paperwork for brothels or that sort of thing, even though that's been failing for a long time? That's where the situation is at right now. Still makes me hopeful because, oh, sex work is just a big happy party. That is no longer the standard attitude I encounter. We've made real inroads.
I will address the final question coming from our audience. This is from Cindy. Do women or men working in the brothels ever try to get out or speak publicly about the reality? I can say absolutely yes. And everyone in this call works very closely with survivors of the sex industry. And it's very important to us that we center their voices and their experiences and their perspectives in all of our advocacy efforts. There's a really important expression which guides me and guides the Jerusalem Institute of Justice, which is nothing about us without us. We're really honored to include their voices and perspectives. And I'm really honored by all the speakers who gave so generously of your time today. Thank you for everyone in attendance. Before you sign off, I want to ask and challenge everyone to take a moment to consider, what can I do to make a positive contribution in this issue? How can I get involved on a local or a national or an international level? Wherever you live, if you live in the United States, in Israel, in Germany, and another European country, anywhere in the world, we feel, all of us on this panel passionately, that the Nordic model is the most effective way to combat the exploitation of women and girls through the prostitution industry. And we hope that as you continue to investigate this, that you'll find real wisdom in this approach and you will advance and promote this within your own local community and the jurisdictions where you live.